Chapter 6 Spallini to the Rescue. The next week was really busy. There were rehearsals every day at school and every evening after dinner. James went to Hobart's Corner to work with Mr. Spallini, and each day James was looking more confident about his magic tricks. So far, he learned how to make a ping-pong ball disappear from right under Mandy's nose, and how to turn a box of torn-up newspaper into a whole page again just by tapping on the box with Mr. Spallini's wand. He was amazing. Mandy had been to Hobart's Corner with James once or twice, but she hadn't been allowed to see how the tricks were done. Mr. Spallini was very serious about keeping the tricks a secret. On Thursday, the two friends visited Amy after school. They found her sitting in a garden chair with her foot propped up in front of her and looking a bit miserable. Minnie's cage was on the grass beside her. "Dr. Prescott says I can go back to school tomorrow," she said, "but I won't be able to do any gymnastics for ages." Mandy and James sat down on the grass. "Susan Davis is going to be the monkey now," Mandy said. Amy nodded. "Susan is in my gymnastics class," she said. "She'll be really good." "At least you'll be able to come and see the play," James said. Amy sighed. "It isn't the same as being in it," she said unhappily. "But I'll cheer you all on. Don't you worry." Mandy bit her lip. Amy was trying hard to make the best of things. "How's Minnie?" she asked. "Minnie is fine," said Amy. She looked at the white mouse running around its cage and tried to smile. "I thought maybe I would bring her to see the play." James giggled. "Just make sure she doesn't get out of her cage and run around," he said. "Can you imagine Mrs. Ponsonby's face?" Amy's smile got wider. "You bet I can," she said. "She'd be up on her chair, screeching the place down." Mandy looked at Amy. Her eyes were dancing with mischief, and she looked much more like her old self. If only she didn't have to miss out on being in the play. But there was nothing they could do about that. Or was there? Sitting there, looking at Minnie running happily around in her cage, Mandy had an idea. She looked at her watch. "Amy, we've got to go now," she said. "We're going to Hobart's Corner to see Mr. Spallini." James got up as well. "We'll see you tomorrow at school," he said. "Or sooner," said Mandy, and James looked at her in surprise. Amy didn't seem to notice. "What do you mean sooner?" James said as they walked down the front path of Amy's house. Mandy hurried him on. "Come on," she said. "I've got something to ask Mr. Spallini." "What?" said James, running to keep up. Mandy gave him a quick smile. "I know Amy can't be in the play," she said, "so we've just got to get Minnie into it instead." "But how will we manage to do that?" said James, running beside her. "I don't know yet," said Mandy, "but we've got to try. I can't stand seeing Amy so unhappy, especially when she's trying so hard to make the best of it. That's why I want to see Mr. Spallini." James looked puzzled. "But what can he do?" he said. Mandy shrugged and ran at the same time. "He's a magician, isn't he?" she said. "He'll be able to think of something." Mr. Spallini gave them a huge smile as they arrived, panting, at Hobart's Corner. He was feeding his doves, and Jack was helping him. "Look!" called Jack as they both came racing across the grass. "The doves are eating out of my hand." "Jack likes to feed them so much they're going to get too fat to fly," Mr. Spallini said, laughing. "Whoops," said Jack. "Maybe I've given them enough." "I think you have," said Mr. Spallini as Bianca fluttered up onto his shoulder. "Let's put them back in their cage." Jack, Mandy, and James helped shut them in while Bianca peered down at them from Mr. Spallini's shoulder. "How is she?" Mandy asked. "She's terrific," the magician said. "I can't thank your mother enough, Mandy. Bianca is totally recovered." Mandy smiled back and looked at the pretty white doves. She certainly looked well. "She's the nicest dove I've ever seen," Mandy said. "She likes to sit on my shoulder," said Jack proudly, "just the way she does with Mr. Spallini." Mr. Spallini looked at Mandy. and James closely. Something tells me you have something you want to talk to me about, he said. James shook his head in wonder. How did you know? He said. Magic, said Mr. Spleeny, and the way you came rushing into the garden. Oh, Mr. Spleeny, it's about Amy, Mandy said. That's the little girl who hurt her foot, isn't it? Said Mr. Spleeny. Mandy nodded. She's so upset that she can't be in the play, and neither can Minnie. Minnie? Said Mr. Spleeny, puzzled. Her white mouse, James said. Mr. Spleeny rubbed his beard and looked thoughtfully. But what can I do? He said. Well, said Mandy, we thought that since you were a magician, you might be able to do some magic for Amy. I can certainly do some tricks for her, to cheer her up, he said. Couldn't you use your magic to make her better? Asked Jack. Mr. Spleeny smiled. That's something magic can't do, Jack, he said. I only wish I could. I thought maybe you could think of some way of getting Minnie into the play, said Mandy. Mr. Spleeny looked at Bianca. The white dove ruffled her silky white feathers and put her head under her wing. I know how the little girl feels, Mr. Spleeny said. I was very upset when I thought I might not have Bianca in my act. He frowned. Then his face lit up. James, he said. James looked up. Yes? Mr. Spleeny smiled, and his eyes began to twinkle. How would you like to do a trick with a mouse? He asked. James blinked and shoved his glasses up on his nose. A trick with an animal? He said. But I've only done tricks with cards and ping-pong balls and things. Mr. Spleeny nodded. I know, he said, but you really are getting quite good. He looked at Mandy. We will have to give Mandy and Jack a special performance. But Mandy wasn't listening. She was grinning with delight. You mean James could do a trick with Minnie in the play? She said. Perhaps, said Mr. Spleeny. We'll have to work out a trick and see if we can fit it into the story of the play. Mandy bit her lip. I hadn't thought of that, she said. The play's finished and everybody knows their lines. We can't change it now. It isn't quite finished, James reminded her. We still haven't decided what to do with Horrible Horace at the end. Mandy swung around. James, you're a genius, she said. That's it. That's the answer. How? Said James. Mandy's eyes were bright. Don't you see? She said. Horrible Horace has to learn his lesson. He's going to be so horrible to everyone because he's bigger than everybody else. He's a great big bully. So, at the end of the play, he should get a dose of his own medicine. He needs to know what it feels like to be small and helpless. She looked at James and Mr. Spleeny. You know, I think there is a part for Minnie in the play after all.